Good afternoon. Welcome to an introductory presentation about Bankers Without Boundaries. We'd like to talk today about our BwB, our background, what we've found out so far in our work with cities, and how we, alongside our other deep demonstration partners, can help. BwB started as an idea based on the premise that governments didn't have a balance sheet big enough to solve the world's environmental and social problems. Mobilising the public and private capital needed to scale projects is a major, if not one of the biggest challenges we face. Investment banks, investment bankers move trillions of dollars every day. We conducted 18 months of research around financial capitals, asking city officials, NGOs, civil servants the question, if you had a bunch of former investment bankers in a room and needed to raise money for your city work, would you A, shoot them, or B, work with them? Thankfully, the answer to that question was B. That was the start of Bankers Without Boundaries. We continue to develop the idea over the coming years, slowly building up the numbers of people who would answer our call. We officially incorporated our social enterprise in 2013, and we've been growing ever since. In terms of my personal background, I started in the City of London in 1994, left in 2008 in the financial crisis, and since then I've been developing and financing renewable and clean tech assets in Europe and Africa. My career in banking was mostly around corporate finance, in cash management, in treasury, and most latterly I was head of sustainability and reputational risks for Standard Chartered.
Like Chris, I've got roughly a 25-year history in banking and finance. I started out as an accountant, worked in banking for many years, latterly as head of research at Royal Bank of Canada. I've also been a corporate CFO in my time. So who are we as an organisation? BwB is a social enterprise. We provide unbiased financial structuring advice to cities, NGOs and authorities. Our sole aim is to maximise environmental and social impact for cities and leverage precious city funds with private sector money. In our research before we started BwB, not only did we find a willing talent pool, we started to understand the missing link that projects and their sponsors were seeking, i.e. how to attract private capital, and we'll talk about that later. We're independent. No one in our team currently works for any investment bank. We all have in the past, but not anymore. That means we don't have to pitch anything, but we do know what the financial markets are looking for and how they work. We speak their language. We've developed deep relationships with institutional champions, the UN, EU, Clinton, Bloomberg, Prince of Wales and others who supply us projects. Our executive team is on the circuit and is linked to the OECD, UN, WF, etc. to help influence policymakers with our perspective and experience. We have relationships across both the buy and sell side, that's banking jargon, but basically either those looking to get others to invest and fund projects, or those looking to invest or fund themselves. These range from the world's largest investment banks, Barclays, RBC, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, to the world's largest investors, BlackRock, Man, Fidelity, Temasek, Adia, etc., across asset classes, geographies, and risk profiles. BwB has moved about $1 billion since beginning, and in our careers across the team, the number is probably above 30 billion for the whole group. We operate a flat organisation working together with experience across different banking product lines, equities, fixed income, investment banking, private equity, asset management, and together we view our client as the environment and social good. We're also very low cost to allow us to invest as much as we can in our biggest asset, our people, who are drawn from a variety of financial disciplines but are united by a commitment to use their financial skills as a force for positive change. We don't have grand offices. In fact, we don't actually have an office at all. We're a core team of senior team of 7. Each of us devote a significant amount of our time to BwB each year. We all worked in the city for far too long. We've all escaped. We've represented hedge funds, asset managers, private equity, equity research, corporate project finance, to name a few. All of us are passionate about changing the investment landscape for the good. We have other layers of resource to draw on, our network of former bankers, many of whom have left their roles recently and who work with us for a period of time. We have a panel of analysts and researchers, much as we would have had in the city. And we have our ambassador group who champion the work we do to help us do more.
So this is a classic, beautiful slide prepared by our friends at Dark Matters Labs. It shows the standard process that cities go through within a Healthy Clean Cities deep demonstration workstream. It starts with framing projects, probing and designing those experiments, and then finally implementing them. The entire process is probably about 18 months for each experiment. In some cases, we fast-track experiments to meet policy objectives or real-world scenarios, such we're experiencing now in COVID-19. Message here, as BwB, it's really important for us to be involved throughout the process. Leaving the idea of how a project will be financed to the end is highly likely to end in a project which results in far more drain on the city purse than may have been required. Looking early at a project, understanding how we might create stable revenue flows or investment opportunities, and also avoiding things which will make a project unbankable are critical. City flow is not just about financing interventions, it's about designing them in an optimal way from a financial perspective to align incentives and improve societal impact. That takes us to what we call the BwB deal engine. So all projects, whether they're in the HCC family or outside, tend to follow a cyclical approach. So from deal flow, project teams from cities will provide information that drives a co-creation process with BwB and our other partners to define potential structures. As mentioned just now, our aim is to avoid limitations in the early stages of development on the project's ability to source capital. Project preparation. Once the project has been scoped, we work with project teams to close identified gaps, drive project investability, and to better assess overall capital requirements. BwB has built an open source project information form that helps cities and sponsors to view what information is available and what might be required. Financial structuring. Based on project parameters, the right kind of financial or capital structure is determined, including sources of capital, be it government versus private, and what instrument, debt versus equity, as well as identifying the need for credit enhancement instruments or guarantees or insurance. BwB, with our friends at KIC, have also developed a city finance framework which aids structuring, analysis, and decision-making for capital allocation. Investor outreach and engagement. We share project details with potential investors to assess interest from the broader financial and impact investor community. We use our networks on the buy and sell side, as mentioned earlier. All this is to guide our structuring advice and input. Finally, term sheet, due diligence, and financial closure. Investors initially provide a term sheet which details around key terms of their project funding, conduct due diligence on parameters, technology, impact, legal and commercial, and then finally fund the project. This is normally around 12 months from project initiation.
So what have we learnt from the Healthy Clean Cities so far since we started in late 2019? Well, there are 5 areas of focus which have consistently been raised across the HCC portfolio of 10 cities over the last 6 months. A lot of this will be self-explanatory to city folk. The first 3 of these are interventions, I guess we would call them, and the latter 2 are enablers. So the first, retrofit and energy generation, usually offers the largest decarbonising opportunity for cities. The timelines of these investments potentially fit well with a pension fund financing timeline, and there's significant scope for job creation and overall citizen buy-in. Mobility, often the second largest decarbonising opportunity, that can reduce air pollution, improve quality of air, and drive co-benefits such as reduced travel time. And then green infrastructure, with broad societal co-benefits requiring innovation to create a direct investment return, and we'll return to that later. And then in terms of the enablers, city transformation funds is something we've talked with a number of cities about, deploying public funding to strategic interventions to crowd in private capital and therefore maximise impact and bring in technical expertise at the city level. And finally, public-private partnerships, the scope for private sector to provide initial capital with long-term ownership residing with public enterprises. And while these themes are consistent in terms of what cities are trying to achieve, once you start to think in practice about investing in a specific location, what becomes clear is that connecting these different areas in a coordinated way maximizes their impact. And what that means is breaking down the silos of how we think. So if, for example, we look at mobility, where reducing demand for cars and therefore parking spaces can create opportunities for green infrastructure investment, and may also provide opportunities for the public sector to work in partnership with the private sector and co-fund these investments together. What we'll do through the rest of the presentation is to talk through the key financial concepts that connect across these intervention types, which can help make them more investable to the financial markets, and how to best use public money and support.
We see 4 broad themes emerge consistently across cities that are highly relevant to our mission as BwB to help you speak the language of the capital markets and how to most effectively attract private capital. So we'll cover each of these in turn. Investment versus funding. This is the difference between public granted money and investment money, and how these pools of capital can leverage each other, co-benefits, how the broader positive impacts of an intervention, including social and environmental, and how to track them can improve the potential return rate and or provide metric impacts for pools of private capital that have sustainability targets as well as financial return targets. De-risking, blending public funds with private, thinking about policy levers, creating scale and diversification can all reduce the risk profile of a project, improving its attractiveness to outside finance. And finally, reducing barriers to mass action. Varying a financial structure and changing how this is proposed can change how individual decision makers decide to act and potentially unlock widespread adoption. We'll talk through each of these in turn before running a case study which brings them all together. Firstly, investment versus grant mindset. A common theme is the language used within cities and how this differs from the way that the financial markets thinks and talks. This is part of the battle. When cities talk about funding, they're typically meaning grants or public money. This generally isn't money which requires a return or needs to be repaid. It's simply about paying for getting things done and not looking for ways where private capital, what we would call investment, can be sourced. This is often, we find, little consideration to the business case. This is like spending a finite budget. Once it's gone, it's gone. If you take an investment mindset, this opens up the possibility of progressing multiple projects in parallel. It's important to note we don't consider that it's the private sector's responsibility to solve the city's problems, but there are certainly multiple opportunities to coexist. We need to identify how and where the private sector and financial markets can participate and create the best conditions for them to do so and for funds or investment to flow.
So let's frame the scale of what we're talking about here. The Climate Bonds Initiative, the CBI, estimates that $100 trillion of climate infrastructure money is required. Public money alone is going to struggle to fund that. What this slide essentially shows is that there is a lot of money in private capital markets. Lots of money is available, it's just not being invested on these kind of projects. It's not finding a home because the conditions are not right. A few years ago, the capital markets didn't think much about the social or environmental impact of their decisions. ESG funds were a niche play, but now this is rapidly changing. Again, the CBI has estimated $45 trillion of funds sit with asset managers who are a member of the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change and/or who signed up to the Principles of Responsible Investing. For every fund we talk to within our network, environmental, social and governance investing is top of their priority list. The asset owners whose money they manage are demanding it, and in fact their staff want them to be doing it too, so it's becoming a talent retention issue. And in a post-COVID-19 environment, that urgency is only going to increase. The key question is how to connect this demand with a supply of investable projects.
So what does having an investment mindset mean when it comes to bankability? To attract private money requires 6 key factors to be considered. They all support each other to contribute to a project which is capable of securing investment at the lowest cost. We look for opportunities where these exist. We need stable returns, predictable cash flows. We need a favourable track record of partners, be it developers, tech providers, or construction companies. We need a sound business plan, sound financial model, and stakeholder consensus and support. We need a robust, stable policy framework. We need to know the rules of the game effectively. And we need to clearly understand the project location and local risks. The last 5 points collectively add up to an assessment of the risk to the return. The less certainly there is, the higher return the investor will seek. A further additional factor is about creating scale. Investors like things to be replicable. This has major benefits in the cost to set up a transaction or investment. Let's look at a very simple working example to show how a classic city case of how we can very simply innovate a transaction from a funding mindset to an investment mindset. 130 million euros was committed by the city to replace 150 diesel with 180 electric buses. The 130 million is a huge proportion of that city's low carbon spend. The cost is split into 3 buckets: assets, the buses; infrastructure, the charging infrastructure; and buildings, garages and maintenance areas. There are 2 real opportunities here. By By redesigning the project from an investment perspective, we can use income that can be derived from charging the buses to create a financial return, which means the proportion of money needed for charging infrastructure will instead be raised from private capital. External investors will not only provide the equipment, but will deliver green power under long-term supply agreements to the charging infrastructure. The capex for the buses is broadly split into two: the buses and the batteries. In short, the city can buy the bus chassis and lease the battery. This reduces how much needs to be spent in year one, replaces upfront capex with an annual cost, which can annually in turn be funded from annual fuel and maintenance savings gained from the move from diesel. This structure now use less than 50 million euros of public money, and in a region of 80 million will now be directed to other public projects.
So on to the second of our four financial concepts, co-benefit values. Let's start with defining what we're talking about. When you spend money on a single intervention or a series of interlinked interventions, you create benefits. Some of those come back to the investor as a direct monetary return. So for example, if you install solar panels, you generate electricity, which you can sell to the grid and use that revenue to repay the initial capital and create a return, thereby supporting the investment case in the first place. However, there are many other benefits that accrue more broadly. For example, improved air quality, increased real estate prices, job creation, etc. These are clearly benefits, though we need to be mindful of just transition and the risk of gentrification. But they don't naturally come back as a direct return to the investor, and therefore can't on the face of it be used as a financing tool. However, these co-benefits are hugely important from a financing perspective. Capturing and measuring these benefits is critical. For example, we all know that a wave of stimulus money is going to be required post-COVID. Therefore, showing job creation of interventions and other economic benefits may be key to capturing that stimulus money. So what is their value? Firstly, with some innovation, they can actually be used to augment the financial return to the investing entity and therefore support fundraising directly. As an example, in New York, when the city invested in the High Line development, which was greening a disused rail line as a public space, it created a huge uplift in local real estate prices. For under $200 million invested by the public authority, $3.5 billion of incremental real estate value was created, of which the public authority only recouped about 100 million through taxation. One of the primary beneficiaries of this were a number of the original contractors on the project who went out and speculated in the property market in the early stages, having realised the impact the project would have on the neighbourhood. The city council that funded the work received limited benefit. Now, could smart property taxation policies or smart contracting have been used to capture some of this value? Secondly, thinking about the various public beneficiaries in a joined up way can lead to co-funding opportunities across department silos. For example, if greening a city reduces healthcare costs, should it be a combined investment approach? In Treviso, we've seen cooperation between green infrastructure spend and healthcare budgets for a new hospital to fund tree planting and have healthcare benefits down the line. And finally, private money managers are dealing with a huge sentiment shift in their underlying client base, i.e. pension holders and other asset owners, who are now demanding that not only are their funds invested to generate a return, but it's also done in a responsible way, ideally with positive environmental, social and governance impacts. Therefore, providing a good data set of the broader impact of interventions can be an increasingly important component to allow asset managers to demonstrate they're complying with their own publicly stated sustainable investment goals when they invest.
I think one obvious and perhaps more difficult example is that of green infrastructure or urban forestation. Various estimates suggest that for every dollar invested in urban forestation, there's a 5 times payback in terms of the value of all benefits, but this almost entirely accrues as co-benefits. From a social perspective, we're talking about benefits such as reduced social isolation, improved mental or physical health, or improved urban management such as noise or traffic control. From an environmental perspective, reductions in the heat island effect, reduction of air pollution, improved rainwater capture, direct sequestration of carbon, and improvements in biodiversity. These are important for the goal of creating fantastic places to live for communities and achieving net zero carbon goals, but aren't very obviously supportive of external finance. Finally, there are a number of clear economic benefits. Improved economic activity, for example. Evidence shows that people spend more in green spaces. Increased real estate prices. such as mentioned in the New York High Line example, reduced air conditioning costs due to heat island effects being reduced, reduced healthcare costs due to improved physical and mental well-being, and lastly, reducing flood mitigation and drainage infrastructure needs. One example from Wells in Cardiff, Wales involved the local water company co-investing alongside the council in a tree planting programme because the water runoff mitigation removed the need to upgrade drainage infrastructure.
So on to the third of our four concepts. As well as headline return metrics, financial investors are very focused on the risks to the financial forecast that underpin those metrics. Through the application of a number of financial concepts in the design of projects, we can reduce the perceived risk of a project from an investment standpoint, thereby making it more attractive. Policy is important, both at the top-down generic level, stability and consistency, but also at a more specific level, for example, providing subsidies or applying carbon taxes, etc. Community engagement can help align interests in a very direct way by encouraging direct community investment into the projects, but also through broader engagement, potentially including social contracting, i.e. a formalised way for communities to come together to agree on a desired change in how their community operates. It's often said that it can be easier to raise larger amounts of money than smaller, so aggregation of projects and scaling up ambition, which often doesn't work in a budgeted funding mindset, can be very helpful in an investment mindset. Equally, aggregation can diversify risk away. One of the concepts we're working on behind the scenes is how to aggregate projects across the cities in HCC, so that from an investor standpoint, geographic and political risk is reduced through diversification. And finally, one of the key concepts we're exploring is the layering or blending of different types of finance to disaggregate risk, effectively to use public money to crowd in private money, which we'll explore in the next slide.
We won't go through this in detail, but this is a potential fund structure for a city innovation fund, where the risk profile of the funds increases as you move down the capital structure. We effectively use public funds at the bottom end, which don't demand a return and potentially are granted rather than invested as a first loss recourse, with development or impact capital in the middle, which may require a lower return because it also has a social or environmental impact agenda, and at the top end of the structure, more commercial money. This structure de-risks the returns for the private money, allowing the fund to scale up the overall capital pool more than it could have done through public funds alone. We can also layer in the ability for the local community to invest and participate in this fund. This structure de-risks the investment for all parties. It can also leverage co-benefits we can capture to provide non-financial returns to impact investors or grant funders. The final concept we'll go through before looking at a case study that brings all this together is how financial structure projects can help reduce barriers to mass adoption. So to show what we mean by the mass action problem, let's look at rooftop solar installation or perhaps building retrofit to drive heating efficiency. Typically, these have revolved around providing cheap, long-term financing or subsidies. Neither have driven enough take-up to transform our building stock or transform our energy grids. Building owners and tenants en masse are not taking a decision to act. Why is that? It's of course a very complex problem with many components, but two key issues stand out from the occupier perspective. Firstly, no matter how strong the economic case looks, they are still being asked to take on significant debt for a long-term return against the cost that is often not a huge part of their own cost base. Psychologically, that's hard to do. And secondly, the logistics of deciding on the right set of interventions, right technology, finding suppliers, and at the end, commissioning the work is complex and time-consuming. So how can we experiment to try and remove those barriers?
We're working with a number of cities around a concept of providing these services as a public service or as a commons to citizens and companies. Rather than lending to the occupier, we finance the work from a central entity. The occupier doesn't need to borrow, but they do need to contract to keep paying their prior power and or heating and maintenance payments. The net savings then finance the upfront capital spend from the central entity, a long-term energy supply model. This could be achieved by allowing a regulated private sector entity to provide the power supply services, or it could come from a publicly controlled body. By centralising decision-making, it opens up the possibility of more coordinated district-wide retrofit, coming to different conclusions on the balance between economic return, decarbonisation return, and broader social and community impact, particularly where the latter might be able to be done at a lower marginal cost when combined with other interventions already happening in a single location. What we mean by that is adding in some low financial return but socially impactful elements to a broad retrofit programme, for example, incorporating green infrastructure, community spaces, etc., in a way that a pure commercial model would never entertain. As an example of this, we have a work in progress model for a citywide distributed rooftop solar and storage project, providing solar generation infrastructure as a mixture of distributed rooftop solar and solar farms on public land to transform the energy system of a city, bringing in the blending of finance that we saw in the last section to fund the upfront payments and the savings in electricity to finance that investment. The technology here is well proven. The innovation is doing this on a large scale and taking ownership into a central entity. This removes the need for building owners to take on debt or deal with the complexity of the specific solution for their building. It also allows the central entity to realise significant economies of scale in the supply chain, as well as think holistically about the energy system for a whole district. Finally, we thought we'd finish with a case study showing how some of these concepts can come together. A case study which shows how we can adopt an investment mindset, reduce barriers to action, de-risk the investment, and create value out of co-benefits.
With our friends in Amsterdam, we've been looking at a district-level, community-focused, energy-efficient retrofit programme. The programme has political support and pilot projects have been identified. When I say district level, we mean retrofitting a range of buildings in the district using a centrally organised funding source. This programme has a real ability to drive a number of the co-benefits we talked about before: lower health costs, CO2 reduction, job creation, increased property value, and overall to improve the quality of life of citizens. We're de-risking this project in a number of ways. Firstly, by seeking to blend finance from a range of sources, all of which see the project in a slightly different way, but they get what they need out of it: public funding alongside impact or private investors. To do this, we need to ensure the project has a clear picture of the co-benefits that the retrofit will realise. Secondly, by de-risking the project through seeking the right policy interventions, for example, through rapid planning decisions, and by incentivising the private sector to innovate with the solutions we will need at scale. Also through community engagement. If we get buy-in from the community, we create a social contract, if you will. Thirdly, by creating an investment mindset and to crowd in private capital, we can scale the ambition and seek to replicate multiple districts by using the precious city purse wisely and for maximum impact. Lastly, we will remove barriers to mass action through financing the retrofit directly via a central fund. The building owner will take on no debt, and the model ensures that they will not be negatively financially impacted through the term of the investment.
So some key things that we, and I say we collectively, Climate Kick and the design partners, are asking of that city. First, the ambition and courage to think big. Secondly, the desire to work across departmental silos, bringing in colleagues from multiple areas. A commitment to long-term consistency around regulatory support for retrofit. These are long-term investors and they need to know the rules aren't going to shift. The establishment of transparent tools to measure and report the realised benefits of the work, not limited to the financial return, but also the broader co-benefits. Engagement with the community. Regulatory support for the supply chain, which will be stretched by the scale of acceleration and should drive material job creation important in economic recovery. And finally, financial support to supply the public funds and/or guarantees to underpin the financial model.
So lastly, to summarise how we can help, getting us involved early in the process, and by going through the deal cycle with you, we can provide unbiased structuring advice as we shape projects which will help cities adopt an investment mindset and get projects in the best shape to attract private capital. We can use our distribution networks to test projects and identify the right partners who will share an interest in the co-benefits of projects, or who will benefit from the presence of others in the transaction. By being smart in the financial model, we can help reduce barriers to mass action, and also by aggregating across institutional champions, we can create high quality bankable projects which can be delivered at the scale we need to see. We look forward to working with you in the future.